That is a good, spirited, fair representation of what I said, and we'll talk through them. He said, I challenge you to debate me on every one of these. Peace, family. It's your brother, Mark Lamont Hill. You're joining me on the Mark Lamont Hill official YouTube channel. We like to have updates every day. We like to have conversations every day. But of course, we also like to, every once in a while, bring in a good debate. And today is one of those days where we're going to have a good, spirited, civil debate for the next hour. And I'll tell you how it started. I posted about a month ago 5 myths about Israel and Palestine. That was a video that I made and posted to the channel. If you haven't seen the video, hang out here now, but later on, go back and watch this video because I break down what I believe are 5 myths about Israel, Palestine. It was an attempt to get people to understand some of the misinformation and disinformation. And it was also an attempt to arm people with talking points and debate points so that they could better understand what's at stake with Israel and Palestine. So I posted that. And after posting that, my 5 points, I got a tweet from Israel Advocacy Movement. And it said, Mark Lamont Hill just presented 5 myths about Israel. And these are my myths, more or less, right? It's not complicated. They've been fighting forever. It's not religious. Pro-Palestine are anti-Semitic, and Palestinians don't want peace. I would say slightly reductive of what I said on a couple of them, but that is a good, spirited, fair representation of what I said, and we'll talk through them. He said, I challenge you to debate me on every one of these points, not some of them, y'all. He said, I challenge you to debate me. I didn't know it was a he at the time, but I challenge you to debate me on every one of these points on your channel or mine. He said, on air, I won't just force you to concede some of these points, but to admit that it is more complicated than you claimed. Do you accept? Now, you know I want the smoke. Of course I wanted to accept. So I immediately accepted. We went into the DM world, which you have to do because sometimes they're bots. Sometimes they're not real people. Sometimes it's crazy stuff, right? So we exchanged for a bit. I did some research. I found out that this is a man. It's a real human being, a staunch pro-Zionist, a staunch pro-Israel voice. And I said, let's have that conversation. And so he quite bravely and nicely is joining us today for a spirited, engaged conversation / debate. Joseph Cohen, founder of the Israel Advocacy Movement, joins us today. Joseph, good to see you.
So first and foremost, thank you for the accepting the challenge. I believe in these dark days, it's really, really important to have dialogue. You don't make, and I'm not calling you my enemy here, but you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. And the only way you make peace is by first listening and understand what is coming from the other side, and then presenting your narrative and hopefully finding that middle ground. I've actually made several videos about you in the past. If you and they've always focused on tweets. And I think when you're responding to a tweet or a short video, it's not a fair representation of that person because you don't give them the opportunity to respond to your charge. And so this is why I felt this would be a really good opportunity for me, one, to understand who you are as a person, but two, challenge some of the misconceptions I believe you have. And thirdly, maybe take something away from you as well, because every time I engage with someone who's advocating for the Palestinian state while I'm advocating for Israel, I tend to learn something because every person has a different perspective and different information that's led them to where they are. So looking forward to this one. Hopefully we can both grow.
Hopefully. So let's start with the first point that I made, that it's not complicated. Now, I know you watched the video, so you know that I offered ironically, some complexity to that point, right? I didn't just say it's not complicated, it's simple. I said that there are all sorts of complexities attached to this issue, from issues around what it means to return, issues around sovereignty, issues around indigeneity. There's lots of issues. I mean, after more than a century of struggle here, Israel-Palestine is certainly complicated at this philosophical level, at the moral level, at the legal level. There's lots of complexities here. But my point was, and remains, that complexity is often used as a way of sidestepping some very fundamental and basic realities here. And it's those fundamental and basic realities that I'm saying are more significant and ultimately, I would say, trump any of the intellectual complexities that may be attached to this battle. And so, yeah, I'll give you the first attempt to kind of engage that idea, and I want to get a sense of what you're thinking about that.
So that I don't misrepresent your position, if it is simple, would you be able to condense it to one sentence, what it is that you're actually saying, in that it's not complicated? What is the simple one-liner?
Yeah, at the end of the 19th century, a movement of this is going to be a long sentence, but it'll be an academic sentence, but it'll be a sentence. At the end of the 19th century, beginning at the end of the 19th century, there was a large scale, relatively large scale, Jewish nationalist movement to return to go to and ultimately settle in the region that I would call historic Palestine. And while those people have some religious, cultural, and historic ties to that land, and certainly there's been a nonstop, uninterrupted presence there, this was largely a movement, not entirely, but largely a movement of European Jewish immigrants at that time to the land, and their immigration into the land ultimately led to the dispossession of the people who were living there at the time.
Okay. So I assume that would be the argument, but I didn't want to misrepresent your position. So I would like to argue and undermine that entire statement, because you start the clock at a particular point in history, but then ignore all the history that was prior to that. So I'm going to roll back a little bit further. There's going to be no contest on the ancient history of the Jews in the land. I'm sure of that. And what I would say with the Roman revolt, the Jews were banished from Jerusalem. So this would have been around 2,000 years ago. They then emigrated to the north of the country, to northern Israel, so the Galilee, that sort of area. And they established some of the most important religious schools that the Jewish people have known. They wrote great works like the Jerusalem Talmud. They wrote incredible rabbis who wrote codifications of Jewish law that we use unto this day, like Yosef Cairo. They lived in Israel. Just before the Islamic colonization of the land in the year 637 by Umar ibn al-Khattab, there was around 200 to 400,000 Jews living in the land. So there was a sizable community. And that community persisted right up until the 20th century, where you started your counting. It diminished in numbers. There wasn't 400,000 by the end of the Ottoman Empire, but there was a Jewish majority in Jerusalem in 1844, according to Caesar Famine, who went on to be the French consul. There was sizable Jewish communities in places like Tzfat. And so I think by starting the clock at the beginning of the 20th century and focusing only on political Zionism and the Jews that came from Europe, and that's absolutely a fair portrayal of what happened. There were Jews that emigrated from Europe into Israel to escape persecution. It ignores the much older Jewish community was there, and it also ignores Arab migration into the land. In 1882, the Ottomans took a census. There were 270,000 Muslim Arabs living in the land. By 1945, when the British census took their census, the village statistics or the report, they found that there was now 1.26 million Arabs living in the land. So there was a huge population explosion. Jews and Arabs moved into the land. Both people had always lived in the land. And what we're really dealing with here is, do Jews have a right to sovereignty versus at the expense of, I would assume you would say, the Arab communities. So would you say that all of that complexity is still contained within your initial statement?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you why. There are people who would dispute some of the history that you're offering. There would be people who would make a disconnection, and I want you to hear me out on this so that I not be misunderstood. There would be people who would say that there is a disconnect between the ancient Jewish populations, that the people who lived in the region before the destruction of the temple, before 70 CE, before the first destruction of the first temple, they would say that those people are not the same people biologically, culturally, ethnically as the people who are making the claim of sovereignty in the land now. If I were making that claim, then what you would raise would be relevant. It would be urgent. It would undermine my claim that it's not complex. But I don't make that claim. I actually believe that that's an anti-Semitic claim. I happen to believe I have no investment in questioning anyone's Jewishness, anyone's genetic ties to the land, anyone's religious or spiritual ties to the land. I don't buy into the sadly reignited Khazar myth, or which has been disputed by all accounts that I've seen. I've seen no intellectual, empirical, biological DNA, none of that stuff. To me, there's no evidence of it, right? So because of all of that, largely the ancient history that you're offering only substantiates the point that I don't dispute, which is that there is a long-standing and enduring Jewish presence and connection to the land. I've never disputed that. So all that history is largely respectfully irrelevant. I think the reason why the 100-year history matters for me is because, as you pointed out, and I agree with you, Jews and Muslims and Christians have lived in the land forever. I don't mean literally forever, but they've lived there for a very long time. That's not in dispute. And the primary, there are fights, there are battles, there are tensions. No place is idyllic. But the type of struggle that we begin to see, as you pointed out correctly, in 1882, at the beginning of the first Aliyah, that from that moment forward, right, which is where I'm beginning the clock. The reason why that is the starting point is because that is the starting point of political Zionism, and political Zionism, not cultural Zionism, not any other form of Zionism. I have no problem with people having a spiritual or cultural connection to a land. I have no problem with people doing whatever they want. The issue is the political Zionism, because that was a form of settler colonialism. And that begins, and I know you don't like the S word, but settler colonialism begins at the end of the 19th century. And because for me, that is the actual problem, it would make no sense for me to debate the Romans or to debate the previous empires where, again, Jews undoubtedly lived. I have no dispute about that. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And first and foremost, I appreciate you not straw manning my position and representing and playing it back fairly. And what I would like to now address is go into some of the things that you mentioned. So first, I'd begin with, I'm not talking about the ancient community. I'm talking about the continuous community that never left. I've got a very good friend of mine whose family lived in Gaza until they were expelled in 1949 by the Egyptians. There's been a continuous Jewish presence. And what we're effectively dealing with,
you'd agree that by the end, you mentioned the Ottoman census of 1882, but by the 1890s, I mean the standard academic, at least that I know of, demography of Palestine had the Jewish population around 5%. Then
it was around 10%, but yeah, it's certainly not the majority.
But it was a very small number. Okay, so I want to be very clear, yeah, because you mentioned that the Palestinian population was 200,000, which could lead someone to believe that there was something comparable with the Jewish population.
Here's the rub. The reason the Jewish community had been diminished from 500,000 effectively at the beginning of the Islamic conquest and grown in different sizes at different points was because of persecution and colonization. Zionism is an anti-colonial movement. We fought the British colonizers, and we fought the Arab colonizers. In 1948, so let's actually, before we go to the 48 war, let's just backpedal a slight bit. And I think it's really important to establish the demographics that we have today are millions and millions of people. Back then, we're talking less than 300,000 people. There was very few people living in the land at all, be they Jewish, be they Arab. There was mass immigration to the land in the fall of the colonial empire of the Ottomans. So the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, effectively, and the moving into the land of the Zionists, who bankrolled almost all of the infrastructure that you saw being built at the beginning of the period that you're talking about. You saw huge immigration of Jews and Arabs. The surnames of the Palestinian people give away their origins. Al-Masri, the Egyptian, Al Saud, the Saudi, Al Maghrebi, the Moroccan, the North African, and Muhammad Al Kurd was from, guess where? Kurdistan. So you had massive immigration of both people, and you had a much smaller community of people that never left the land, be they Arabs or Jews. There were ancient Arab communities as well. It wasn't, many people think that the Arabs only came with Umar ibn al-Khattab in 637. You had communities like the Nabateans in the south towards Jordan. And so you've had Jews and Arabs continuously in the land in very small numbers. But then you saw a population explosion that is unparalleled for anywhere else in the Middle East at that time in this geography, because both communities, for different reasons, were attracted. Jews ideologically and religiously in some cases, and Arabs economically. That was what was driving the majority of Arab immigration during the period we're talking about. And so what I want to try and establish is, can you see the complexity there? That you have the collapse of the Ottoman Empire ultimately, which leaves a power vacuum, and two communities that have both lived in the land in relatively small numbers, but then rapidly expanding, and then both having fair claims to statehood and both vying for statehood. That's my argument. That's the complexity. Two people, both in the land, both want some sort of sovereignty, and neither really being able to compromise on the other's claims.
Yeah, I would disagree with significant parts of that representation. Nothing that you said is untrue, but it's the missing parts that would make one read too much into that. For example, yes, you said the numbers were relatively small. I agree, it's a fact, right? Relatively small compared to now, sure. Or even to the middle part of the 20th century, even by the time the League of Nations is formed or the UN is formed, we're talking about much larger numbers. However, the Palestinian population was dramatically, extraordinarily, and if you want to I don't want to quibble over the word Palestinian, so let's just say for now the Arab population. The Arab population of the region at that time was dramatically, overwhelmingly the majority. It wasn't even close. Again, by the end of the 19th century, we're talking about maybe a 5% population of Jews, and that's including some who had arrived in the first Aliyah, but obviously, as you know, often didn't fare so well up until 1904. So it's not as if there's these two small pockets of people, or 1903, it's not as if there are these two small pockets of people who are now vying for statehood. That's the first point. I would say that there are Palestinian people on the land who are now encountering a wave of European immigration for very specific, and we'll get to this, I think, later, political, I would argue, much more than religious purposes. But regardless of their reason, they're arriving in the land and they are disrupting the status quo and the norm. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean, in all I'm just saying that it shifted the demographics, it shifted the civil, and it shifted the order of things. You said both were vying for statehood. I would push back against this idea of statehood. You know, at the end of the Ottoman period, you know, we were still a world of empires. And so the idea of the state or the nation state was nascent at best, and I would argue hasn't really even come to fruition yet. Part of the one of the enduring legacies of the post-World War I period, and certainly the interwar period, is the emergence of the nation state and a commitment to protecting nation states. You'd agree with that, I think. So I wouldn't say that they both had commitments to the land. I would also add that even to the extent that the early Yishuv, or the early sort of pre-nation state Jewish community that was there, to the extent that they wanted a homeland or a state, and I do think they wanted a state, I think you're right about that, that's not what the Palestinians were necessarily interested in, because there was no need for that. Just like there was no need to